Good day, everyone. This presentation is about the characteristic of earthquake ruptures and dynamic of fault deformation on propagating faults. It is the work of my former PhD student Simon Preuss and is recently published in Solid Earth, the European Geosciences Union open access journal. And you can access the paper through this link here. So fault networks and their damage zones are geometrically complex. On the left here, you see an overview of some of the observations with off-fault fans of distributed deformation, first generation Riedel-Splay faults and second generation Riedel-Splay faults in there, and wing cracks. And on the right, you see an example of the recent Ridgecrest earthquakes with geometrically complex faults and also even perpendicular fault structures here. So in this presentation, I will address how and how much dynamic earthquake ruptures and aseismic deformation affect fault growth and the fault structures that we see here. So we use the seismothermomechanical modeling approach that Robert Herrendorfer updated with rate and state friction and adaptive time stepping to resolve spontaneous and dynamic earthquake ruptures in addition to the long-term fault evolution. To do so, we solve the conservation of mass and momentum on viscoelastoplastic rheology here. And on the right here, you see the continuum-based invariant rate and state friction formulation, where you see your classical rate and state friction formulation in an invariant sense, and which amongst others means that the slip rate is calculated from the plastic strain rate and the second variant thereof multiplied by the fault width. So Simon Preuss also added a new model ingredient, making our setup 2.5 dimension. That means that we use a generalized Elsasser approach to represent the response of the lower crustal, more viscous substrate here, in the sense that if we have an earthquake on this predefined fault here, where we only truly simulate the surface here, that response gives us the shear stress response of the lower crustal substrate here that is added to the surface displacements here. So we have this predefined fault here that we will start to fail. And one short note here is that he also added an adaptive measure of fault width, which is relevant in the localization phase when we go from no fault up to a thin fault, because our measure of fault width being just one grid size is not yet representative there. So we implement a measure as a function of slip rate that when it's really fast, it localizes up to that grid size. So when doing that, it means that our results are grid size depend convergent, even in this train localization phase. As you see from each of the plots here, that both of the angles of the fault with respect to shear direction and sigma 1, and it being in the aseismic or in the seismic mode, are all convergent with grid size. So another question is what to use for the bulk rate and state friction parameters. Rate strengthening, rate weakening, we have evidence for both. So we test that. And in the left side here, we see the rate and state friction response, where you get localization of a fault even in the rate strengthening bulk on the Riedel-Splay and a conjugate angle here. And if you look at the plot through time, you see that after we have one event here, where during which the fault growth in pink here was first minor, and then after that event in the interseismic period, you see fault length increasing rapidly through aseismic deformation. We see the same if we use a rate neutral formulation, where we have an even more rapid aseismic growth of the fault up to the boundaries of the domain, at which point we have to stop the simulation. But what it says is that the fault growth rates are very, very high, much higher than what would you expect from nature. And also in the rate weakening case, where here the conjugate angle becomes more dominant. We see large contribution from aseismic deformation, and only through including a strengthening from rate strength, a transition, excuse me, from rate strengthening to rate weakening is when we're able to simulate a slower growth rate of the fault and thereby simulate multiple earthquakes. So episodic fault growth here. So that we do through strain weakening of the bulk parameters of L and B, though this could be A as well. And we have some laboratory evidence for this as well. So if we look at that model in detail, we have our predefined fault here. Through time, in the first event, we have during the aseismic deformation, mainly the off-fault fan that is formed. But we see the start of two angles here. And during the next events, particularly in the aseismic period, you see this growth here. So here I visualize all aseismic periods in green and blue. And you see that the fault grows a lot. If you look at what was growing during dynamic events, that is represented by these pink dots, which is much smaller components of fault growth, was largely due to aseismic deformation, at least in all of the models, up to more than 1,000 models that we tested. So if you look at the amount of off-fault deformation in the fan here, we observe that it is to a large extent dependent on the fault angle with respect to sigma 1. So if the fault angle is parallel to the boundaries of the model and the loading direction, as is in many models, we have a distinct amount of off-fault deformation, particularly 1.3% on the plastic deformation and 6.7 plastic deformation on the fault in our plastic deformations. But this angle is not optimally oriented. It is in this diagram of friction versus alpha, it is misoriented here. While if it would grow spontaneously, it would form along this Coulomb angle. So that is what happens in our other models before that we looked at before, where you see the fault propagating there. So if we predefine the fault to be as such, what we observe is that the amount of off-fault deformation is significantly less. So the energy dissipated of the fault decreased by a factor of 6.5 to 0.2%. So if we look in more detail at this off-fault fan, you see that after increasing for some distance, it saturates at some point. And this saturation distance and the maximum of it are related to the finite depth of the seismogenic zone, as was shown in two earlier papers by Pablo. This occurs as a crack rupture transits to a pulse rupture, in our case, due to the stress transfer back from the viscous substrate towards the surface. So without a healing front being present here. And we show that it's linearly also related to the thickness of the crust up to the viscous substrate, such that if you increase this distance, also the width of the outer damage zone increases and the distance at which a saturation starts, as is theoretically expected. If we look into the primary and secondary Riedl's place that develop as the rupture continues and grows into the bulk, we see various interactions and structures that we also see in natural observations, as I summarize here on the bottom. And here I show a movie from Simon on a very complex example of splay fault interactions there, where essentially the complexity and the amount of localization are increased with depth. So here we show model results for a larger pressure. Note though that there's no temperature dependence or change in deformation mechanism here. And we have a bit more fault weakening and a thicker crust. So if we see slip rates, changes in pressure or mean stress, and changes in sigma 1 directory. So we see a lot of complexity where the changes in stresses are affecting what happens on the other branches. So branches can stop here and arrest, or they interact in arrest only after they've intersected. And we can see variations in rupture speed. And if you go to more aseismic deformation in between, you can also see fault bands here. So in this particular setup, we also see that basically this main splay fault replaces the main fault of the model here because it's more optimally oriented. So in conclusion, in our homogeneous medium under the parameters that we ran, even though we tested thousands of them, what we see can always is that aseismic deformation is the predominant cause for fault growth. So we saw it in this presentation for a range of bulk rheologies, where we only get an episodic fault growth if we transit from rate strengthening to weight weakening in the bulk with increasing plastic strain. And seismic deformation helps to localize, so it sets already the fault angles to a bit steeper part, and it stimulates a steeper fault angle. And seismic deformation predominantly causes off-fault deformation, where the amount of off-fault deformation is strongly dependent on the initial stress field orientation. And the complexity that we see also in the primary and secondary structures is seems to be largely related to the degree of non-optimality of the stress field with respect to the existing faults. Thank you very much